in the new Zeitschrift for music. Not long ago, mention was made of an Hebraic art taste. An attack and defense of that expression neither did nor could stay lacking. Now it seems to myself not unimportant to clear up the matter lying at the bottom of all of this. A matter either glossed over by our critics hitherto, or touched with a certain outburst of excitement. It will not be a question, however, of saying something new, but of explaining that unconscious feeling which proclaims itself among the people as a rooted dislike of the Jewish nature. Thus, of speaking out of something really existent, and by no means of attempting to artfully breathe life into an unreality through the force of any sort of fancy. Criticism goes against its very essence, if, in attack or defense, it tries for anything else. Since it here is merely in respect of art, and especially of music, that we want to explain to ourselves the popular dislike of the Jewish nature, even at the present day, we may completely pass over any dealing with this same phenomenon in the field of religion and politics. In religion, the Jews have long ceased to be our hated foes, thanks to all those who, within the Christian religion itself, have drawn upon themselves the people's hatred. In pure politics, we have never come to actual conflict with the Jews. We have even granted them the erection of a Jerusalemitic realm. And in this respect, we have rather had to regret that Herr V. Rothschild was too keen-witted to make himself king of the Jews, preferring, as is well known, to remain the Jew of the kings. It is another matter where politics become a question of society. Here, the isolation of the Jews has been held by us a challenge to the exercise of human justice, for just so long as in ourselves the thrust towards social liberation has woken into plainer consciousness. When we strove for emancipation of the Jews, however, we virtually were more the champions of an abstract principle than of a concrete case. Just as all our liberalism was a not very lucid mental sport, since we went for freedom of the folk without knowledge of that folk itself. Nay, with the dislike of any genuine contact with it, so our eagerness to level up the rights of Jews was far rather stimulated by a general idea than by any real sympathy. For, with all our speaking and writing in favor of the Jews' emancipation, we always felt instinctively repelled by any actual operative contact with them. Here, then, we touch the point that brings us closer to our main inquiry. We have to explain to ourselves the involuntary repellence possessed for us by the nature and personality of the Jews, so as to vindicate that instinctive dislike, which we plainly recognize as stronger and more overpowering than our conscious zeal to rid ourselves thereof. Even today, we only purposely belie ourselves in this regard when we think necessary to hold immoral and taboo all open proclamation of our natural repugnance against the Jewish nature. Only in quite the latest times do we seem to have reached an insight that it is more rational to rid ourselves of that strenuous self-deception, so as quite soberly instead to view the object of our violent sympathy and bring ourselves to understand a repugnance still abiding with us, in spite of all our liberal bedazzlements. To our astonishment, we perceive that in our liberal battles, we have been floating in the air and fighting clouds, whereas the whole fair soil of material reality has found an appropriator whom our aerial flights have very much amused, no doubt, yet who holds us far too foolish to reward us by relaxing one iota of his usurpation of that material soil. Quite imperceptibly, the creditor of kings has become the king of creeds, and we really cannot take this monarch's pleading for emancipation as otherwise than uncommonly naive, seeing that it is much rather we who are shifted into the necessity of fighting for emancipation from the Jews. According to the present constitution of this world, the Jew, in truth, is already more than emancipate. He rules and will rule so long as money remains the power before which all of our doings and our dealings lose their force. That the historical adversity of the Jews and the rapacious rawness of German Christian potentates have brought this power within the hands of Israel's sons, this needs no argument of ours to prove. That the impossibility of carrying farther any natural, any necessary, and truly beauteous thing, upon the basis of that stage whereat the evolution of our arts has now arrived, and with a total alteration of that basis, that this has also brought the public art taste of our time between the busy fingers of the Jew, however, is the matter whose grounds we here have to consider somewhat closer. What their thralls had toiled and moiled to pay the liege lords of the Roman and medieval world, today is turned to money by the Jew. Who thinks of noticing that the guileless-looking scrap of paper is slimy with the blood of countless generations? What the heroes of the arts, with untold strain consuming leaf and life, have wrested from the art fiend of 2 millennia of misery, today the Jew converts into an art bazaar, who sees it in the mannered bric-a-brac that it is glued together by the hollowed brow sweat of the genius of 2,000 years? We have no need to first substantiate the bejewing of modern art. It springs to the eye and thrust upon the senses of itself. Much too far afield, again, should we have to fare, did we undertake to explain this phenomena by a demonstration of the character of our art history itself. But if emancipation from the yoke of Judaism appears to us the greatest of necessities, we must hold it weighty above all to prove our forces for this war of liberation. Now, we shall never win these forces from an abstract definition of that phenomena per se, but only from an accurate acquaintance with the nature of that involuntary feeling of ours, which utters itself as an instinctive repugnance against the Jew's prime essence. Through this unconquerable feeling, if we avow it quite without ado, must there become plain to us what we hate in that essence. What we know then definitely, we can make head against. Nay, through his very laying bare, may we even hope to rout the demon from the field, whereon he has only been able to maintain his stand beneath the shelter of a twilight darkness, a darkness that we good-natured humanists ourselves cast upon him, to make his look less loathly. The Jew, who, as everyone knows, has a God all to himself, in ordinary life strikes us primarily by his outward appearance, which, no matter to what European nationality we belong, has something disagreeably foreign to that nationality. Instinctively, we wish to have nothing in common with a man who looks like that. This must heretofore have passed as a misfortune for the Jew. In more recent times, however, we perceive that in the midst of this misfortune he feels entirely well. After all his successes, he needs must deem his difference from us a pure distinction. Passing over the moral side and the effect of this in itself unpleasant freak of nature, and coming to its bearings upon art, we here will observe that to us this exterior can never be thinkable as a subject for the art of representment. If plastic art wants to present us with a Jew, it mostly takes its model from sheer fantasy, with a prudent ennobling or entire omission of just everything that characterizes for us in common life the Jew's appearance. But the Jew never wanders on to the theatric boards. The exceptions are so rare and special that they only confirm the general rule. We can conceive no representation of an antique or modern stage character by a Jew, be it as hero or lover, without feeling instinctively the incongruity of such a notion. This is of great weight. A man whose appearance we must hold unfitted for artistic treatment, not merely in this or that personality, but according to his kind in general, neither can we hold him capable of any sort of artistic utterance of his inner essence. By far more weighty, nay, of quite decisive weight for our inquiry, is the effect the Jew produces upon us through his speech, and this is the essential point at which to sound the Jewish influence upon music. The Jew speaks the language of the nation in whose midst he dwells from generation to generation, but he speaks it always as an alien. As it lies beyond our present scope to occupy ourselves with the cause of this phenomenon, too, we may equally abstain from an arraignment of Christian civilization for having kept the Jew in violent severance from it, as on the other hand, in touching the sequelae of that severance, we can scarcely propose to make the Jews the answerable party. Our only object here is to throw light on the aesthetic character of the said results. In the first place, then, the general circumstance that the Jew talks the modern European languages merely as learnt, and not as mother tongues, must necessarily debar him from all capability of therein expressing himself idiomatically, independently, and conformably to his nature. A language, with its expression and its evolution, is not the work of scattered units, but of an historical community. Only he who has unconsciously grown up within the bond of this community takes also any share in its creations. But the Jew has stood outside the pale of any such community, stood solitarily with his Jehovah in a splintered, soilless stock, to which all self-sprung evolution must stay denied, just as even the peculiar Hebraic language of that stock has been preserved for him merely as a thing defunct. Now, to make poetry in a foreign tongue has hitherto been impossible, even to geniuses of highest rank. Our whole European art and civilization, however, have remained to the Jew a foreign tongue. For just as he has taken no part in the evolution of the one, so has he taken none in that of the other. But at most, the homeless white has been a cold, nay more, a hostile looker-on. In this speech, this art, the Jew can only after speak and after patch, not truly make a poem of his words, an artwork of his doings. In particular, does the purely physical aspect of the Jewish mode of speech repel us. Throughout an intercourse of 2 millennia with European nations, culture has not succeeded in breaking the remarkable stubbornness of the Jewish naturel as regards the peculiarities of Semitic pronunciations. The first thing that strikes our ear as quite outlandish and unpleasant is in the Jew's production of the voice sounds is a creaking, squeaking, buzzing snuffle. Add thereto an employment of words in a sense quite foreign to our nation's tongue, and an arbitrary twisting of the structure of our phrases, and this mode of speaking acquires at once the character of an intolerably jumbled blabber. So that when we hear this Jewish talk, our attention dwells involuntarily on its repulsive how, rather than any meaning of its intrinsic what. How exceptionally weighty is this circumstance, particularly for explaining the impression made on us by the music works of modern Jews must be recognized and borne in mind before all else. If we hear a Jew speak, we are unconsciously offended by the entire want of purely human expression in his discourse. The cold indifference of its peculiar blubber never by any chance rises to the ardor of a higher, heartfelt passion. If, on the other hand, we find ourselves driven to this more heated expression in converse with a Jew, he will always shuffle off, since he is incapable of replying in kind. Never does the Jew excite himself in mutual interchange of feelings with us, but, so far as we are concerned, only in the altogether special, egoistic interest of his vanity or profit. A thing which, coupled with the wry expression of his daily mode of speech, always give to such excitement a tinge of the ridiculous, and may rouse anything you please in us, not only sympathy with the interest of the speaker. Though we well may deem it thinkable that in intercourse with one another, and particularly where domestic life brings us purely human feelings to an outburst, even the Jews may be able to give expression to their emotions in a manner effective enough among themselves. Yet this cannot come within our present purview, since we here are listening to the Jew who, in the intercourse of life and art, speaks expressly to us. Now, if the aforesaid qualities of his dialect make the Jew almost incapable of giving artistic enunciation to his feelings and beholdings through talk, for such an enunciation through song, his aptitude must needs be infinitely smaller. Song is just talk aroused to its highest passion. Music is the speech of passion. All that worked repellently upon us in his outward appearance and his speech makes us take to our heels at last in his song, providing we are not held prisoners by the very ridicule of this phenomenon. Very naturally, in song, the vividest and most indisputable expression of the personal emotional being, the peculiarity of the Jewish nature attains for us its climax of distastefulness, and on any natural hypothesis we might hold the Jew adapted for every sphere of art excepting that whose basis lies in song. The Jew's sense of beholding has never been of such a kind as to let plastic artists arise among them. From ever have their eyes been busied with far more practical affairs than beauty and the spiritual substance of the world of forms. We know nothing of a Jewish architect or sculptor in our times, so far as I am aware. Whether recent painters of Jewish descent have really created in their art, I must leave to connoisseurs to judge. Presumably, however, these artists occupy no other standing toward their art than that of modern Jewish composers toward music, to whose plainer investigation we now will turn. The Jew, who is innately incapable of announcing himself to us artistically through either his outward appearance or his speech, and least of all through his singing, has nevertheless been able in the widest spread of modern art varieties, to wit in music, to reach the rulership of public taste. To explain to ourselves this phenomenon, let us first consider how it grew possible to the Jew to become a musician. From that turning point in our social evolution, where money, with less and less disguise, was raised to the virtual patent of nobility, the Jews, to whom money-making without actual labor, i.e. usury, had been left as their only trade, the Jews not merely could no longer be denied the diploma of a new society that needed naught but gold, but they brought it with them in their pockets. Wherefore our modern culture, accessible to no one but the well-to-do, remained the less a closed book to them, as it had sunk into a venal article of luxury. Henceforward, then, the cultured Jew appears in our society. His distinction from the uncultured, the common Jew, we now have closely to observe. The cultured Jew has taken the most indicible pains to strip off all the obvious tokens of his lower co-religionists. In many a case, he has even held it wise to make a Christian baptism wash away the traces of his origin. This zeal, however, has never got so far as to let him reap the hoped-for fruits. It has conducted only to his utter isolation, and to making him the most heartless of all human beings, to such a pitch that we have been bound to lose even our earlier sympathy for the tragic history of his stock. His connection with the former comrades in his suffering, which he arrogantly tore asunder, it has stayed impossible for him to replace by a new connection with that society whereto he has soared up. He stands in correlation with none but those who need his money, and never yet has money thriven to the point of knitting a goodly bond twixt man and man. Alien and apathetic stands the educated Jew in midst of a society he does not understand, with whose tastes and aspirations he does not sympathize, whose history and evolution have always been indifference to him. In such a situation, we have seen the Jews give birth to thinkers. The thinker is the backward-looking poet, but the true poet is the foretelling prophet. For such a prophet charge cannot equip save the deepest, the most heartfelt sympathy with a great, alike endeavoring community, to whose unconscious thoughts the poet gives exponent voice. Completely shut from this community by the very nature of his situation, entirely torn from all connection with his native stock, to the genteeler Jew, his learnt and paid-for culture could only seem a luxury, since at bottom he knew not what to be without it. Now, our modern arts had likewise become a portion of this culture, and among them, more particularly, that art which is just the very easiest to learn, the art of music, and indeed that music which, severed from her sister arts, had been lifted by the force and stress of grandest geniuses to a stage in her universal faculty of expression, where either in new conjunction with the other arts she might speak aloud the most sublime, or, in persistent separation from them, she could also speak at will the deepest bathos of the trivial. Naturally, what the cultured Jew had to speak, in his aforesaid situation, could be nothing but the trivial and indifferent, because his whole artistic bent was in sooth a mere luxurious, needless thing. Exactly as his whim inspired, or some interest lying outside the art, could he utter himself now thus and now otherwise, for never was he driven to speak out a definite, a real and necessary thing, but he just merely wanted to speak, no matter what, so that, naturally, the how was the only moment left for him to care for. At present, no art affords such plenteous possibility of talking in it without saying any real thing as that of music, since the greatest geniuses have already said whatever there was to say in it as an absolute separate art. When this had once been spoken out, there was nothing left but to babble after, and indeed with quite distressing accuracy and deceptive likeness, just as parrots reel off human words and phrases, but also with just as little real feeling and expression as those foolish birds. Only in the case of our Jewish music makers, this mimic speech presents one marked peculiarity, that of Jewish style of talk in general, which we have more minutely characterized above. Although the peculiarities of the Jewish mode of speaking and singing come out the most glaringly in the commoner class of Jew, who has remained faithful to his father's stock, and though the cultured son of Jewry takes untold pains to strip them off, nevertheless they shew an impertinent obstinacy in cleaving to him. Explain this mishap by physiology as we may, yet it is also its reason in the aforesaid social situation of the educated Jew. However much our luxury art may float in well-nigh nothing but the aether of our self-willed fantasy, still it keeps below, one fiber of connection with its natural soil, with the genuine spirit of the folk. The true poet, no matter in what branch of art, still gains his stimulus from nothing but a faithful, loving contemplation of instinctive life, of that life which only greets his sight amid the folk. Now, where is the cultured Jew to find this folk? Not, surely, on the soil of that society in which he plays his artist role? If he has any connection at all with this society, it is merely with that offshoot of it, entirely loosened from the real, the healthy stem. But this connection is entirely loveless, and this lovelessness must ever become more obvious to him. If, for the sake of foodstuff for his art, he clambers down to that society's foundations, not only does he here find everything more strange and unintelligible, but the instinctive ill will of the folk confronts him here in all its wounding nakedness, since, unlike its fellow in the richer classes, it here is neither weakened down nor broken by reckonings of advantage in regard for certain mutual interests. Thrust back with contumely, I don't know what that word is, from any contact with this folk, and in any case completely powerless to seize its spirit, the cultured Jew sees himself driven to the taproot of his native stem, where at least an understanding would come by all means easier to him. Willy-nilly he must draw his water from this well, yet only a how, and not a what, rewards his pains. The Jew has never had an art of his own, hence never a life of art-enabling import, an import a universally applicable, a human import. Not even today does it offer to the searcher, but merely a peculiar method of expression, and that the method we have characterized above. Now, the only musical expression offered to the Jew tone-setter by his native folk is the ceremonial music of their Jehovah rites. The synagogue is the solitary fountain whence the Jew can draw art motives at once popular and intelligible to himself. However sublime and noble we may be minded to picture to ourselves this musical service of God in its pristine purity, all the more plainly must we perceive that that purity has been most terribly sullied before it came down to us. But here for thousands of years has nothing unfolded itself through an inner life-fill. But, just as with Judaism at large, everything has kept its fixity of form and substance. But a form which is never quickened through renewal of its substance must fall to pieces in the end. An expression whose content has long since ceased to be the breath of feeling grows senseless and distorted. Who has not had occasion to convince himself of the travesty of a divine service of song, presented in a real folk synagogue? Who has not been seized with a feeling of the greatest revulsion, of horror mingled with the absurd, at hearing that sense and sound confounding gurgle, yodel and cackle, which no intentional caricature can make more repugnant than is offered here in full, in naive seriousness? In latter days, indeed, the spirit of reform has shewn its stir within this singing, too, by an attempted restoration of the older purity. But, of its very nature, what here has happened, on the part of the higher, the reflective Jewish intellect, is just a fruitless effort from above, which can never strike below, to such a point that the cultured Jew, who precisely for his art needs, seeks the genuine fount of life amid the folk, may be greeted by the mirror of his intellectual efforts in that fount itself. He seeks for the instinctive, and not the reflected, since the latter is his product, and all the instinctive he can light on is just that out-of-joint expression. If this going back to the folk source is as unpurposed with the cultured Jew as unconsciously enjoined upon him by necessity and the nature of the thing, as with every artist, with just as little conscious aim, and therefore with an insuperable domination of his whole field of view, does the hence derived impression carry itself across into his art productions. Those rhythms and melismi of the synagogue song usurp his musical fancy in exactly the same way as the instinctive possession of the strains and rhythms of our folk song and folk dance made out the virtual, shaping force of the creators of our art music, both vocal and instrumental. To the musical perceptive faculty of the cultured Jew, there is therefore nothing seizable in all the ample circle of our music, either popular or artistic, but that which flatters his general sense of the intelligible. Intelligible, however, and so intelligible that he may use it for his art, is merely that which any degree approaches a resemblance to the said peculiarity of Jewish music. In listening to either our naive or our consciously artistic musical doings, however, were the Jew to try to probe their heart in living sinews, he would find here really not one whit of likeness to his musical nature. And the utter strangeness of this phenomenon must scare him back so far that he could never pluck up nerve again to mingle in our art creating. Yet his whole position in our midst never tempts the Jew to so intimate a glimpse into our essence, wherefore, either intentionally, provided he recognizes this position of his towards us, or instinctively, if he is incapable of understanding us at all, he merely listens to the barest surface of our art, but not to its life-bestowing inner organism, and through this apathetic listening alone can he trace external similarities with the only thing intelligible to his power of view, peculiar to his special nature. To him, therefore, the most external accidents on our domain of musical life must pass for its very essence, and therefore, when as artist he reflects them back upon us, his adaptations must seem to us outlandish, odd, indifferent, cold, unnatural, and awry, so that Judaic works of music often produce on us the impression as though a poem of Goethe's, for instance, were being rendered in the Jewish jargon. Just as words and constructions are hurled together in this jargon with wondrous inexpressiveness, so does the Jew musician hurl together the diverse forms and styles of every age and every master. Packed side by side, we find the formal idiosyncrasies of all the schools in motliest chaos. As in these productions the sole concern is talking at all hazards, and not the object which might make that talk worth doing, so this clatter can only be made at all inciting to the ear by its offering at each instant a new summons to attention, through a change of outer expressional means. Inner agitation, genuine passion, each finds its own peculiar language at the instant when, struggling for an understanding, it girds itself for utterance. The Jew, already characterized by us in this regard, has no true passion, and least of all a passion that might thrust him on to art creation. But where this passion is not forthcoming, there neither is any calm. True noble calm is nothing else than passion mollified through resignation. Where the calm has not been ushered in by passion, we perceive naught but sluggishness. The opposite of sluggishness, however, is nothing but that prickling unrest which we observe in Jewish music works from one end to the other, saving where it makes place for that soulless, failingless inertia. What issues from the Jews' attempts at making art must necessarily, therefore, bear the attributes of coldness and indifference, even to triviality and absurdity. And in the history of modern music, we can but class the Judaic period as that of final unproductivity, of stability gone to ruin. By what example will this all grow clearer to us? Well nigh, what other single case could make us so alive to it as the works of a musician of Jewish birth whom nature had endowed with specific musical gifts as very few before him? All that offered itself to our gaze in the inquiry into our antipathy against the Jewish nature, all the contradictoriness of this nature, both in itself and as touching us, all its inability, while outside our footing, to have intercourse with us upon that footing, nay, even to form a wish to further develop the things which had sprung from out our soil. All these are intensified to a positively tragic conflict in the nature, life, and art career of the early taken Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. He has shewn us that a Jew may have the amplest store of specific talents, may own the finest and most varied culture, the highest and the tenderest sense of honor, yet without all these preeminences helping him, were it but one single time to call forth in us that deep, that heart-searching effort which we await from art, because we know her capable thereof, because we have felt it many a time, and oft, so soon as once a hero of our art has, so to say, but opened his mouth to speak to us. To professional critics, who haply have reached a like consciousness with ourselves hereon, it may be left to prove by specimens of Mendelssohn's art products our statement of this indubitably certain thing. By way of our illustrating our general impression, let us here be content with the fact that, in hearing a tone piece of this composer's, we have only been able to feel engrossed where nothing beyond our more or less amusement-craving fantasy was roused through the presentment, stringing together an entanglement of the most elegant, the smoothest and most polished figures, as in the kaleidoscope's changeful play of form and color. But never where those figures were meant to take the shape of deep and stalwart feelings in the human heart. In this latter event, Mendelssohn lost even all formal productive faculty. Wherefore, in particular, where he made for drama, as in the oratorio, he was obliged quite openly to snatch at every formal detail that had served as characteristic token of the individuality of this or that forerunner whom he chose out for his model. It is further significant of this procedure that he gave the preference to our old master Bach as special pattern for his inexpressive modern tongue to copy. Bach's musical speech was formed at a period of our history when music's universal tongue was still striving for the faculty of more individual, more unequivocal expression. Pure formalism and pedantry still clung so strongly to her that it was first through the gigantic force of Bach's own genius that her purely human accents broke themselves a vent. The speech of Bach stands toward that of Mozart, and finally of Beethoven, in the relation of the Egyptian Sphinx to the Greek statue of a man. As the human visage of the Sphinx is in the act of striving outward from the animal body, so strive Bach's noble human head from out the periwig. It is only another evidence of the inconceivably witless confusion of our luxurious music taste of nowadays that we can let Bach's language be spoken to us at the same time as that of Beethoven, and flatter ourselves that there is merely an individual difference of form between them, but nowise a real historic distinction, marking off a period in our culture. The reason, however, is not so far to seek. The speech of Beethoven can be spoken only by a whole, entire, warm-breathed human being, since it was just the speech of a music man so perfect, with that the force of necessity he thrust beyond absolute music, whose dominion he had measured and fulfilled unto its utmost frontiers, and shewed to us the pathway to the fecundation of every art through music, as her only salutary broadening. On the other hand, Bach's language can be mimicked at a pinch by any musician who thoroughly understands his business, though scarcely in the sense of Bach, because the formal has still therein the upper hand, and the purely human expression is not as yet a factor so definitely preponderant that its what either can or must be uttered without conditions, for it is still fully occupied with shaping out the how. The washiness and whimsicality of our present musical style has been, if not exactly brought about, yet pushed to its utmost pitch by Mendelssohn's endeavor to speak out a vague and almost nugatory content as interestingly and spiritedly as possible. Whereas Beethoven, the last in chain of our true music heroes, strove with the highest longing and wonder-working faculty for the clearest, certaintest expression of an unsayable content through a sharp-cut, plastic shaping of his tone pictures, Mendelssohn, on the contrary, reduces these achievements to vague, fantastic shadow forms, midst whose indefinite shimmer our freakish fancy is indeed aroused, but our inner, purely human yearning for distinct artistic sight is hardly touched with even the merest hope of a fulfillment. Only where an oppressive feeling of this incapacity seems to master the composer's mind and drive him to express a soft and mournful resignation has Mendelssohn the power to shew himself characteristic in the subjective sense of a gentle individual that confesses an impossibility in view of its own powerlessness. This, as we have said, is the tragic trait in Mendelssohn's life history. And if in the domain of art we are to give our sympathy to the sheer personality, we can scarcely deny a large measure thereof to Mendelssohn, even though the force of that sympathy be weakened by the reflection that the tragic in Mendelssohn's situation hung rather over him than came to actual sore and cleansing consciousness. A like sympathy, however, can no other Jewish composer rouse in us. A far-famed Jewish tone-setter of our day has addressed himself in products to a section of our public whose total confusion of musical taste was less to be first caused by him than worked out to his profit. The public of our opera theater of nowadays has for long been gradually led aside from those claims which rightly should be addressed, not only to the dramatic artwork, but in general to every work of healthy taste. The places in our halls of entertainment are mostly filled by nothing but that section of our citizen society whose only ground for change of occupation is utter boredom. The disease of boredom, however, is not remediable by sips of art, for it can never be distracted of set purpose, but merely duped into another form of boredom. Now, the catering for this deception, that famous opera composer has made the task of his artistic life. There is no object in more closely designating the artistic means he has expended on the reaching of this life's aim. Enough that, as we may see by the result, he knew completely how to dupe, and more particularly by taking that jargon which we have already characterized and palming it upon his ennuied audience as the modern piquant utterance of all the trivialities which so often had been set before them in all their natural foolishness. That this composer took also thought for thrilling situations and the effective weaving of emotional catastrophes need astonish none who know how necessarily this sort of thing is wished by those whose time hangs heavily upon their hands. Nor need any wonder that in this his aim succeeded too, if they but will ponder well the reasons why, in such conditions, that the whole was bound to prosper with him. In fact, this composer pushes his deception so far that he ends by deceiving himself, and perchance as purposely as he deceives his bored admirers. We believe, indeed, that he honestly would like to turn out artworks, and yet is well aware that he cannot. To extricate himself from this painful conflict between will and can, He writes operas for Paris and sends them touring around the world, the surest means today of earning oneself an art renown, albeit not an artist. Under the burden of this self-deception, which may not be so toilless as one might think, he, too, appears to us well nigh in a tragic light. Yet the purely personal element of wounded vanity turns the thing into a tragic comedy, just as in general, the uninspiring, the truly laughable, is the characteristic mark whereby this famed composer shews his Jewhood in his music. From a closer survey of the instances adduced above, which we have learnt to grasp by getting to the bottom of our indomitable objection to the Jewish nature, there more especially results for us a proof of the ineptitude of the present musical epoch. Had the two aforesaid Jewish composers, in truth, helped music into riper bloom, then we should merely have to admit that our tarrying behind them rested on some organic debility that had taken sudden hold of us. But not so was the case. On the contrary, as compared with bygone epochs, the specific musical powers of nowadays have rather increased than diminished. The incapacity lies in the spirit of our art itself, which is longing for another life than the artificial one now toilsomely upheld for it. The incapacity of the musical art variety itself is exposed for us in the art doings of Mendelssohn, the uncommonly gifted specific musician, but the nullity of our whole public system, its utterly unartistic claims in nature, in the successes of that famous Jewish opera composer, grow clear for anyone to see. These are the weighty points that have now to draw towards themselves the whole attention of everyone who means honestly by art. Here is what we have to ask ourselves, to scrutinize, to bring to plainest understanding. Whoever shirks this toil, whoever turns his back upon this scrutiny, either since no need impels him to it, or because he waives a lesson that possibly might drive him from the lazy groove of mindless, feelingless routine, even him we now include in that same category of Judaism in music. The Jews could never take possession of this art, until that was to be exposed in it which they now demonstrably have brought to light, its incapacity for life. So long as the separate art of music had a real organic life need in it, down to the epochs of Mozart and Beethoven, there was nowhere to be found a Jew composer. It was impossible for an element entirely foreign to that living organism to take part in the formative stages of that life. Only when a body's inner death is manifest do outside elements win power of lodgment in it, yet merely to destroy it. Then indeed that body's flesh dissolves into a swarming colony of insect life. But who, in looking on that body's self, would hold it still for living? The spirit that is, the life, has fled from out that body, has sped to kindred other bodies. And this is all that makes out life. In genuine life alone can we, too, find again the ghost of art, and not within its worm-befretted carcass. I said above, the Jews had brought forth no true poet. We here must give a moment's mention, then, to Heinrich Heine. At the time when Goethe and Schiller sang among us, we certainly know nothing of a poetizing Jew. At the time, however, when our poetry became a lie, when every possible thing might flourish from the wholly unpoetic element of our life, but no true poet, then it was the office of a highly gifted poet Jew to bear with fascinating taunts that lie, that bottomless aridity and Jesuitical hypocrisy of our versifying, which still would give itself the airs of true poesis. His famous musical congeners, too, he mercilessly lashed for their pretense to pass as artists. No make-believe could hold its ground before him. By the remorseless demon of denial, and all that seemed worth denying, he was driven on without a rest. Through all mirage of our modern self-deception, till he reached the point where in turn he duped himself into a poet, and was rewarded by his versified lies being set to music by our own composers. He was the conscience of Judaism, just as Judaism is the evil conscience of our modern civilization. Yet another Jew have we to name, who appeared among us as a writer. From out his isolation as a Jew, he came among us seeking for redemption. He found it not, and had to learn that only with our redemption, too, into genuine manhood, would he ever find it. To become man at once with us, however, means firstly for the Jew as much as ceasing to be Jew. And this had Burna done. And yet Burna, for all others, teaches us that this redemption could not be reached in ease and cold indifferent complacence, but costs. As cost it must for us, sweat, anguish, want, and all the dregs of suffering and sorrow, without once looking back. Take ye your part in this regenerative work of deliverance through self-annulment. Then are we one and undissevered. But bethink ye that one only thing can redeem you from the burden of your curse, the redemption of Ahasuerus, going under.